Hayakawa, Hayakawa, Hayakawa. I do want to talk about the great S.I. Hayakawa, professor of English, who wrote a classic on semantics called Language in Thought and Action. Now, many years ago, in the 70s, when I was in college and getting a degree in English literature, I'd hear about this book. It came highly recommended. Some version of it has existed since 1938, so it's gone through like 6 editions, or at least this is the 6th edition here. I'd always said to myself, one of these days I'll get around to reading it, but it fell through the cracks for the longest time. Until last year, and not just the election, but the news media's coverage of the election made me finally want to pick up my copy and read it. And I'm glad I did. This comes highly recommended. It's only 180 pages long. The writing is a model of clarity. A 15-year-old could wrap his head around what old S.I. is saying. But the best thing about the book for me is your ability to spot propaganda, understanding how propaganda is made, figuring out what propaganda is up to is greatly improved after reading this book. So in upcoming videos, we're going to be taking SI a chapter at a time and showing the core idea. There's even practical applications for this, which I'll talk about later. Samuel Ichie Hayakawa, July 18th, 1906, February 27th, 1992, was a Canadian-born American academic and politician of Japanese ancestry. A professor of English, he served as president of San Francisco State University and then as U.S. Senator from California from 1977 to 1983. Professionally, Hayakawa was a linguist, psychologist, semanticist, teacher, and writer. He served as an instructor at the University of Wisconsin from 1936 to 1939 and at the Armour Institute of Technology, Illinois Institute of Technology as of 1940 from 1939 to 1948. His first book on semantics, Language in Thought and Action, expanded its forerunner and Book of the Month Club selection, Language in Action, written from 1938 to 1941. With 5 editions from 1949 to 1991, Language in Thought and Action helped to popularize Alfred Korzybicki's general semantics and semantics in general, while semantics or theory of meaning was overwhelmed by mysticism, propagandism, and even scientism. In the preface, Hayakawa cautioned, "The original version of this book, Language in Action, published in 1941, was in many respects a response to the dangers of propaganda, especially as exemplified in Adolf Hitler's success in persuading millions to share his maniacal and destructive views. It was the writer's conviction then, as it remains now, that everyone needs to have a habitually critical attitude towards language, his own as well as that of others, both for the sake of his personal well-being and for his adequate functioning as a citizen. Hitler is gone, but if the majority of our fellow citizens are more susceptible to the slogans of fear and race hatred than to those of peaceful accommodation and mutual respect among human beings, our political liberties remain at the mercy of any eloquent and unscrupulous demagogue." There's one more loose end concerning Language in Thought and Action and S.I. Hayakawa. How should I put this? In my last video on old S.I., I left a distinct impression that I had read this book for the first time back in December. And at the time, I actually believed that. Well, it turns out that might not exactly be the case. In fact, in December when I was reading this, I'm in the last chapter and I'm reading along and I could have sworn I read that paragraph before. And it was at that moment I started wondering, had I read this book before? Was it a case of deja vu? No, it was more of a case of deja, I'm an idiot, because it turns out, yes, I had read this book before, and I'd completely forgotten I had. And I'm like, wow, that never happened to me before. I mean, by now you should know, I read a lot. I read all sorts of different things. Most books I can remember where I was when I read them, when I read them. Complete blank on this, right? And guess how I busted myself? Do you remember that video I did called In a Trunk of a T-Bird? I think it's number 31. Where I actually do Jimmy Hoffa. I had that copy of I Heard You Paint Houses by Charles Brandt about the relationship between Jimmy Hoffa and that mobster Frank Sheeran. Well, what ended up happening was I thought, you know, that's almost 15 minutes of yak. I could cut that out of the video and load that up on BitChute, which I did. So that's why I went to that video. But it turns out, if you go further into it, in the next 15 minutes, there's like 7 minutes on Las Vegas shooting yak. And then at the end, what I do is I put on this engineer's cap and I start talking about language and thought and action, and I'm waving the book around, and it's like I'm talking about two-valued logic, which is a central idea to what Hayakawa was talking about. I'm like going, you know, I obviously I read it, but the problem is I don't even remember doing that video. Wow. Whoa. Okay. Well, there's a subject for the next video. How did this happen? Well, what I'm doing here today is talking about the phrase conspiracy theory, which if you listen to corporate-controlled mainstream news, you get to hear it tossed around quite a bit. Actually, it's an old phrase. I heard it in the early 70s, and I've even seen examples of it in print publications from the late 19th century. So, as a phrase, it's been around a while. Perhaps you've heard the famous story about the CIA memo that noted the formation of a vocal minority of skeptics who are looking at the Warren Commission's conclusions at the end of the investigation into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And this vocal minority was saying, hey, the story doesn't make any sense. Well, apparently somebody at the CIA said, this will never do. And so the memo recommends taking the phrase conspiracy theory and seeding it to their contacts in the media. And if anybody ever feels like writing an article or doing a story about this group that is questioning the conclusions of the Warren Commission, well, just say they're peddling conspiracy theories. They're conspiracy theorists, which becomes synonymous with the word kook. At that point, the phrase becomes a meaningless smear. It is only designed to intimidate, to shut down conversations about the Kennedy assassination, to shut down questioning. That's all. But if you're interested in semantics, which is the study of meaning, and apply some of the basic principles to what Brother Spook is doing, In this instance, he's destroying meaning. What a scummy thing to do. Alright, let's say I'm outside and I'm walking down the street and I'm minding my own business and I hear somebody say, "Hey, conspiracy theorist." I'm like, what? Stop what you're doing for 1 second, motherfucker, and listen. I'm the English teacher from hell, and you're about to get schooled. And it's for your own good. Let's take the phrase conspiracy theory and break it in two, shall we? All right. So you got the word conspiracy. What's it mean? Two people plotting a crime in private? Exactly. Now let's take the word theory. Define it. What does it mean? A hypothesis that needs to be tested? Very good. Now put the two together. What do you have? Two people or more in private plotting a crime is a hypothesis that needs to be tested. So when you call me a conspiracy theorist, is that sort of what you mean? Now, am I supposed to test this hypothesis, or am I not supposed to test this hypothesis? And can you see the logic problem? I mean, the Justice Department of the United States government indicts people for conspiracy all the time. You're not implying that conspiracies don't occur, are you? All right. This is what I love about S.I. Hayakawa and semantics, which is the study of meaning. You can stop a bullshit artist right in his tracks. You can catch people trying to destroy meaning. Okay, over the last 80 years, there have been mysterious deaths, assassinations, bombings, and mass shootings, which have had conspiracy theories spring from them. I got a list. Oh, man. The granddaddy of them all. General George S. Patton's mysterious car accident in 1945. A soldier was quoted as saying, "The bastards got him." JFK, 1963. Malcolm X, 1965. Stay away from that if you want to keep breathing. Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, 1968. Ronald Reagan, the attempt on his life, 1981. The Oklahoma City bombing, 1995. 9/11, which I consider a bombing. That's just me. The Route 91 Harvest Festival massacre in Las Vegas, 2017. And I'll even include the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018 because I got a line on some weird stuff. But, so, each one of these events inspired a conspiracy theory and a group of people who spend time. What do they all have in common? The official story doesn't make any sense. And when you think about it, there has to be a structure to what we call conspiracy theory. It has to have a geometry, which goes like this. You've got the official story over here. It was just Lee Harvey Oswald and him all by himself. And then you have this vocal minority over here saying, the story doesn't make any sense. The official story doesn't make any sense. That's true of all of them. You have the vocal minority with all of these. That links them, and the other thing that links them is that every conspiracy theory is a circumstantial case with little to no evidence. The circumstances in a circumstantial case are stories destined for the witness stand. Okay? After the election, I started listening to Mayor Rudolph Giuliani on his YouTube channel, which is called Rudy's Common Sense, and I was getting into what he had to say. I think it was his video number 89, where he talks about the importance of the circumstantial case. And I'm like, yeah. He invokes the legacy of the great trial attorney Louis Nizer, who said that, not always, but maybe 9 times out of 10, the circumstantial case will pay off for you big time in cross-examination, right? I mean, let's say you have this criminal trial and you have numerous witnesses and they have all part of the big story, but they have their chunk of the story, right? Their point A, B, C, and D. So you get the witness up on the stand and you're working them through, you're talking them through the story. You're going from point A to point B, okay, that's nice, and from point B to point C. But then you get to point C and you're being contradicted, or the witness being contradicted by other witnesses, contradicting what's being said in the police report. Maybe it's a case of faulty memory. Maybe you've nabbed yourself a perjurer. But in every one of those instances, it comes down to this. Hey, at point C, the story doesn't make any sense. So, why is the idea of conspiracy theory such a bad one? When all it is the circumstantial case. It is a tool that is used by attorneys. It has a legitimate place in the courtroom. You begin to realize that you could switch it out with synonyms, right? Conspiracy theory, you could call it secret history, which was going back to like the 70s, and you had books like Robert Anton Wilson's The Illuminati Trilogy, which was this underground bestseller. It was just all about JFK assassination and all kind of other conspiracies. But back then it was considered secret history, right? The history they're keeping from you. The history they don't want you to hear. And I mean, obviously there's stuff being kept from us. There's stuff that's secret. So secret history is not really saying much. Who's in the news recently? Anybody catch this? Daniel Ellsberg, the guy who leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times during the Nixon administration. And there was like a Supreme Court case that Nixon lost. He was trying to block the publication of these papers. He got rebuked. And when the news media was presenting these papers to you, what did they call it? The secret history of the Vietnam War. So, okay, I guess secret histories do happen occasionally. And it's okay to use that synonym then, but not use this synonym now. Hey, Alex, what's a good synonym for synonym? Shut up. So anyway, picking up where we left off in the last Farm Garage video, I was talking about being perplexed by the fact that in December of 2020, I read S.I. Hayakawa's Language and Thought in Action and could have sworn I was reading it for the first time. And it turns out not to be the case, as I found out. This has never happened to me before. I've been reading all my life. I'm a big reader compared to the average, I guess. But any book I've read, I have a pretty good idea where I was when I read it and when I read it. I read The Exorcist in paperback in high school. Wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Read The Godfather twice. Second time I read it, I just finished reading this book on how to write the best-selling novel, and it was on the reading list. I remember reading Moby Dick in high school. I remember reading Ulysses in college. I remember reading I, the Jury on Trips to the Can. I don't forget reading books normally, but in this particular case, completely blanked on reading this. First time I read it was 2018. Now, in context, back then the Human Nature channel was deep into doing videos about the Las Vegas shooting. And the Las Vegas shooting truth community talked about those guys a lot. I think I was using what was in this book and applying it to that situation. And it's funny, I found this video of me talking about the book, and quite clearly I knew what was in it then, and I knew what was in it later. I just don't know what happened in between. So, we'll finish up tonight by once again mentioning S.I. Hayakawa's Language in Thought and Action. I will put on my social engineer hat for this. Woo woo! Anyway, what made Hayakawa's book interesting to me is he identifies ways in which we use language that are almost automatic processes inside us. And he gives these processes names. Abstraction, for example. We never notice how we or the people around us or what is said in media goes from low abstraction to high abstraction and back again all the time. We don't stop and think about these things because if we did, we'd probably not be able to speak. But knowing about the constant process of abstraction adds a previously unseen dimension to communication. Hayakawa explains how abstraction of language involves a value orientation. First off, there is the two-valued orientation, and it's very easy to understand. Good versus evil, us versus them, Federalists versus anti-federalists, capitalism versus communism, Coke versus Pepsi, shooters on the ground versus single shooter in the hotel, everybody versus Mike Turber. It is the lowest level of abstraction because it is the most simplistic. And I hope it isn't lost on you that this happens to be the level at which political campaigns operate. Republican versus Democrat. What else do you need to know? Hayakawa then takes us to the next stage, which is multi-valued orientation. That's the level of more accurate descriptions of reality. The map is not the territory, so how good is your map anyway? World War II was not simply liberty versus fascism. It also had something to do with the U.S. government prior to the war, putting the squeeze on Japan's oil supplies with embargoes of shipments, prompting an already militarized nation like Japan into striking back. The world is not black and white in the ways politicians describe it to us. And the politicians know this. They're not that stupid. But they instinctively understand that it's easier to persuade people with a two-valued orientation because a two-valued orientation aims directly at the gut. Sadly, when that happens, most people have left their critical thinking skills with the hat check girl. I'll tell you what's got me worried now. I may have read this 3 times. Monday night, I'm on the phone with my invisible partner. He's part of my mastermind group, if you ever read Think and Grow Rich. He's a great sounding board. And we were talking about possible reasons behind my epic forgetfulness. Well, let's just get the most obvious one out there. You're getting old there, Alex. You were having a senior moment there, Granddad. We're all going to end up like you eventually. Will you still need me? Will you still feed me? When I'm 64, boom, boom. This is like giving a video camera and editing software to a guy with Tourette's syndrome, isn't it? Anyway, the second possible reason behind me forgetting that I read Language in Thought and Action may have something to do with context. Imagine you're back in school, high school, college, and you have a test the next day and you're cramming for it. You are reading all of the course material you should have read 2 weeks ago and you stay up all night doing it. The next day you take the test. You may even have done well on it, but as soon as you leave the classroom, you're going to forget everything you were cramming into your head the night before. That is a poor way to learn, because all you're really doing is temporarily retaining information and then the next day regurgitating it. You won't have any understanding, you won't retain anything. So, going back to 2018, something similar may have happened to me, because at the time I was heavily invested into doing videos on the Las Vegas shooting and talking about the Las Vegas shooting truth community as a group. I was always looking for ideas, and I guess I picked up a copy of Language and Thought in Action, and I'm reading it for something I could use. Now, at the time, the Las Vegas shooting truth community resembled the Hatfields and the McCoys. You had the Paladin group over here that was saying Paddock was a patsy. He was dead on the floor of that hotel room for hours. Somebody else did the shooting. And then you had the other group over here, Mike Turber and his associates, saying, if there was a second shooter, explain how he got out of that hotel room. You can't do it. So, as I'm reading Language and Thought in Action, and I came across the idea of two-valued logic, I said, hey, I can apply that. Because two-valued logic, as opposed to multi-valued logic, where you have multiple points of view orbiting around an issue, two-valued logic is the logic of the battlefield. It's the logic of us versus them. It's the logic of political campaigns and political arguments. It's the logic of a football game. It's not good, it's not necessarily bad, it just is. And at that level, you end up dealing with a lot of abstractions, and that's really all you do. So I think what was happening was I was reading Language and Thought in Action quickly, found what I needed, and then put it aside and immediately forgotten everything that I retained from it after that point. And there's another aspect to this too. Language and Thought in Action is a book about propaganda. Understanding propaganda, being able to decode propaganda when you see it, is what this book is all about. Now, I'm not looking at the Las Vegas shooting truth community as a group of people that's putting out propaganda. I didn't see it that way. I don't particularly believe that's the case. Maybe you can find some examples of it, but I never connected the propaganda side of the book with what I was seeing in the Las Vegas shooting truth community. Fast forward to December 2020. By this point, I have seen how the news media has treated Donald Trump, and it's pretty obvious that it was always two-valued logic from the beginning. Corporate elites, Democrats, people in the news media, we're the good guys. Trump and his supporters, they're the bad guys. It was 4 years of that. So I'm sitting there going, okay, I'm understanding this. I would like to go a little deeper. So I went back and reread Language and Thought in Action. And I was seeing examples of what old SI was talking about day in and day out. So now, when it comes to Language and Thought in Action, I have a pretty good idea what's in here. the latter of abstraction is a very, very important component to understanding this book. I'm going to be talking about that later. So, all in all, that's probably the reason I didn't remember reading it. There is a third extremely far-fetched possibility that between 2018 and 2020 sometime, I was abducted by a UFO. And they conducted experiments on me, and they wiped my memory, and then they dropped me back down here in my apartment. And of course I wouldn't remember anything. That really is a silly idea. No. Ooh, why did that happen all of a sudden? But the reason I did this video is because of Meet the Press with Chuck Todd. I watch it every Sunday. I'm a political junkie, okay? I want to hear the establishment point of view for what it's worth, which in my opinion is not much anymore. But my problem is I just don't have much respect for Chuck Todd, even though I put myself through that every Sunday and I'm like looking at him like, oh God. And this goes back to 2016, okay, where the primaries were still happening. It wasn't even a foregone conclusion that Trump was going to get the nomination yet. But there was all that stuff about Hillary Clinton's emails and her server and how it was handled improperly, and so many other people have gone to jail for handling classified material that way. And she gets a pass, and she gets a pass from FBI Director James Comey. Remember that Boy Scout? I can't remember the last time I saw an FBI director come out and have a presser, but he did. And he said, oh yeah, Mrs. Clinton mishandled these documents and this document and these documents, but nothing that comes to the threshold of a prosecutable offense or, some bullshit like that. Chuck Todd interviewed FBI Director James Comey, okay? And the subject was Anthony Weiner and his laptop. Now, you remember Weiner, right? This knucklehead who's married to Huma Abedin, who works for this one. So here's Chuck Todd with Comey, and he's there. Well, you have Anthony Weiner's laptop. Is there any connection between it and Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign? And Comey is like, no, we didn't find any connection at all. And I'll never forget this. The camera is on Chuck Todd, right? And he's fond of putting his finger to his lips, and you can almost see him say, he almost said his name. No, Chuck, don't do that. Shh. It's obvious. Is there a connection between Anthony Weiner's laptop and the Hillary Clinton campaign? Yeah, her name is Huma. Oh my goodness. Do you remember Mike Wallace from, back in the 60s, even before that? I mean, he was around for a long time. Mike Wallace would have never let anybody get away with that. Okay, so for a long time, I just had no respect for Chuck Todd whatsoever. And, oh my goodness, since 2016, he's always been a never-Trumper, right? It's always been the two-valued logic. Me and, well, all the people I know, we're the good guys. Trump and all his supporters, they're the bad guys, right? Where does this guy get his monopoly on virtue? I don't know. And it does get worse, okay? There's only one reason Joe Biden ran for president, and that was to keep Hunter out of the slammer, okay? And I'm not going to go into all the Burisma stuff. Hunter Biden on Pornhub, pictures of him there with this humongous crack pipe hanging out of his mouth. All that on the laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop, which Chuck Todd, when it came up at all, said, ooh, has all the earmarks of Russian disinformation. And he's basically, mannequin of, what's that guy's name? Brennan. Yeah, Brennan. Oh yeah, Russians would do something like that. Well, no, everything on it was, as they said, Hunter left it at a laptop repair store, computer repair store, completely forgot he left it there. It's got all this incriminating stuff, right? Chuck Todd barely mentions it at all. It's just propaganda until the Justice Department says, oh, we're looking into this. And Chuck Todd has to report that. And between you, me, and the lamppost, nothing's going to happen to Hunter Biden, okay? One last thing. I watch NBC News. I don't watch anybody else. But election night, I'm at the farm. I'm at Dad's farm. And I'm watching the election, watching the results. And about 1:30 in the morning, they said, well, down in Atlanta at the Sears Center where they're counting votes, they had a water main break. And everybody's going home for the night. And that was the point. I said, well, if that's it, I might as well just go to bed and wake up in the morning and see that President Trump had won. Chuck Todd lied to me, okay? There was never any water main break. When somebody finally gets to the bottom of the story, it was either a leaky commode or a running commode. I'm not exactly sure which, but couldn't have been all that serious because after everybody was shooed out of the voting counting, we all know people came right back in. Hey, Starless. Get the cats. Doo-doo-doo. Flew in from Miami Beach, BOAC. Didn't get to bed last night. On the way, the paperback was on my knee. Man, I had a dreadful flight. I'm back in the USSR. Bam, 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 bam. You know how lucky you are, boy. Back in the USSR. Bam, bam, bam. Been away so long I hardly knew the place. Gee, it's good to be back home. Leave it till tomorrow to unpack my case. Honey, disconnect the phone. I'm back in the USSR. Bam, 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 bam. You know how lucky you are, boy. Back in the US, back in the US, back in the USSR. Well, Ukraine girls really knock me out. They leave the West behind. And Moscow girls make me sing and shout. And JoJo's always on my mind. I'm back in the USSR, bum, 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 bum. You know how lucky you are, boy. Back in the US, back in the US, back in the USSR. Well, Ukraine girls really knock me out. They leave the West behind. And Moscow girls make me sing and shout. And JoJo's always on my mind. Boom! Show me around those great big mountains way down south. Take me to your daddy's farm. Let me hear you bellow like it's ringing out. Come and keep your comrade warm. I'm back in the USSR. Boom, boom, boom. You know how lucky you are, boy. Back in the US, back in the US, back in the USSR. Oh, woo. Well, yeah, I think that makes a nice segue into the second part of this video, which I call S.I. Hayakawa rocks. So anyway, S.I. Hayakawa rocks. Future videos I have in mind on old S.I. would amount to an adult education course. But what I'm trying to do is create a mental filter for you, which you can use anytime, and this filter will become more sophisticated as we go through language and thought and action. So the next time you sit down in front of the news, you will be a more sophisticated consumer of the news, assuming you still bother to watch the news. But on Sunday, when I'm sitting there watching Meet the Press, you better believe I'm going to have my filter on. You ain't getting away with shit this time, Chuck Todd. This thing even has a light on the top. Let's see. I'm serious. The Walking and Talking Human Encyclopedia and my invisible partner have been very supportive of this project and have given me some very good suggestions. The Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia said I should define some of SI's big concepts first so people will know what I'm talking about when they come up later. For example, the ladder of abstractions is a concept we'll get into. After that, there will be a disquisition on the nature of institutions, which SI shows, in terms of language, has more effect on the way we speak than you may think. By the way, this is where the anarchists miss the boat. The problem isn't the idea of government, which, at its Greek and Roman root words, means to steer a ship. The problem is that government is an institution. The United States government is a huge institution. It's institutions inside of institutions like boxes inside of boxes. You can get rid of government, but institutions will still pop up. Anyway, the first of SI's big concepts that I want to talk about are the 3 levels of abstraction. It goes something like this. The first level is the level of the report. The second level is the level of inference, and the third level is the level of judgment. And let me create a little scenario to illustrate what I'm talking about. You see Joe staggering across the street. At the level of report, like a police report, that's all you can say. I saw Joe staggering across the street. You can't say why. You have no idea, really. You're not that close. You just see him at a distance. Okay. The second level of abstraction is the inference. Well, I saw Joe staggering across the street like he was drunk. Suddenly we're getting into maybe. Suddenly you're guessing at an explanation. The third level of abstraction is the level of judgment. I know Joe. He drinks all day. He's a drunk. That's why he was staggering across the street. So, that's how that works. And I did say in an earlier video that there are practical applications to this, and I'll explain. Now, this is going back a couple of weeks. The Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia says, I'm not cooking tonight. We're all getting sandwiches from Peppers and that. And I'm like, great. Now, a little plug for Peppers and that. It's this great bar restaurant in Rankin. And attached to the bar, I guess you'd call it a pavilion. It's like this huge porch with a roof over it. There's tables out there. I even took my invisible partner down there one Sunday when they had music. and in the corner there were these four Italian guys, and they had speakers, and I guess he had a CD player. The CD they were playing was just instrumental tracks, and these guys were singing over them, and they were doing all these doo-wop songs, and they were doing oldies. And I turned to my invisible partner and I said, next to the love of the Pittsburgh Steelers, it doesn't get any more Pittsburgh than this. And I'll bet Scott knows what I'm talking about. Anyway, so this is a Saturday, and the cleanup man won sandwiches, and I won sandwiches, and the Walking Talking Encyclopedia says, yeah, sandwiches. So we get on the Peppers and that, and not only did we get those sandwiches, but we got these green banana peppers stuffed with hot Italian sausage. Now, keep that pepper in mind. Keep these peppers in mind. They will play an important role later in the story. Anyway, we leave Peppers and that. We go back to their house. The cleanup man gets his sandwich. Me and the Human Encyclopedia go over to my apartment, where we eat the sandwiches, drink tequila, and watch movies until like 4 in the morning. Okay. The next day, there was a controversy between the cleanup man and the Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia. And I don't find out about this until Monday. On Monday, I had to drive the cleanup man to the doctor. So we're in the car, and he's like, you want to hear what happened about my sandwich? I'm like, what? He's like, there was tomato sauce on it. I didn't want tomato sauce. So I tell the Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia there was tomato sauce on my sandwich. You want to know what he did? And I'm like, what did he do? He started coming up with explanations for how the tomato sauce got on my sandwich, and he thinks it came off of the green banana peppers, which had tomato sauce all over them. He's answering a question I didn't even ask. And I just had one of those amazing moments where I'm like, wow, I know exactly what's going on here because I have read Language and Thought in Action. The cleanup man is at the level of report. There was tomato sauce on my sandwich. What the Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia did was he jumped to the level of inference, and he's trying to come up with explanations for how the tomato sauce got on the guy's sandwich. And the guy, like, you're answering a question I didn't ask, and you're making my blood pressure go up. And I'm like, okay. And I didn't say this to the cleanup man, but in my mind it says, I'm going to have to talk to the Human Encyclopedia about this. But the funny thing is, you got to understand what type of guys we are. Me and the Human Encyclopedia, we're all college boys, right? That sort of thing, jumping from levels of abstraction, it's what academics do. He and I do it all the time. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't make my blood pressure go up. Now, the cleanup man is interesting in that he didn't go to college. He's a smart guy, don't get me wrong, but he doesn't like debate. He doesn't like argument. In fact, I've seen him do this. Me and the Human Encyclopedia are in the kitchen, and we're talking something, political. And the cleanup man comes into the kitchen, states his position, expects it to be respected, and we're like, yeah. Then he leaves the kitchen, goes back upstairs and makes a drink. And we're like, yeah, the guy doesn't like to argue. Me and the Human Encyclopedia, I would have made a joke out of it, right? I would have said, oh, what are you saying? That banana pepper with the hot sausage in it opened up the lid of my sandwich box, got in, molested my sandwich, closed the lid, and is now pretending that nothing bad happened? I would have laughed it off. And actually, he and I both were laughing about this when it finally came up. And like I said, the high blood pressure is part of it. Don't give the guy who is generous with his liquor a stroke. You're going to give me a stroke. Human Encyclopedia, to his credit, understood exactly what I was talking about. He's like, yeah, I see what you mean. So as you can see, there was a practical application there, and it's all about communication, and kind of after that we were all sort of communicating a little better, so I consider that a win. Here's the thing about the Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia. I think in a way he was defending the honor of Peppers and that. Oh, he's such a knight errant. The cleanup man and the Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia play Dungeons and Dragons. And all three of us are fans of Game of Thrones, right? The cleanup man has the complete series on Blu-ray, so do I. In fact, if the Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia were a character in Game of Thrones, he'd be Sir Greybag of the House of Walmart. I'm so bad. Everything I know about farm garages, I learned there. I guess you could say I was homeschooled in farm garage. And that is another other. Because I used to have a bias against those who were homeschooled. I used to say I never met anybody who was homeschooled that wasn't crazier than a shithouse rat. And I used to believe this. I used to feel that way. But then there was a reason why I stopped feeling that way. And it's a classic case of the map is not the territory. Which is something S.I. Hayakawa says in the preface of Language and Thought and Action, which I was, reading a couple hours ago. And it's so true. And let me tell you how this came about. Let's say 17 years ago. Was it that long? Seems like it. I met this guy in a coffee shop, and I just liked him right off the bat. He was very personable. He was funny. And the more I got to know him, the more I liked him. Because it turns out that he was skilled with computer graphic packages, doing computer artwork. The type of graphics package he used was more towards commercial art, I do believe. But I had worked 12 years doing computer-aided drafting on AutoCAD in engineering. So even though it was a different sort of work, it's still menu-driven lines and circles and squares and layers and colors and all sorts of interesting things. So he and I already spoke the same language. It's like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about in a lot of areas. So yeah, he became a good friend. I would actually go over to the place where he was staying every once in a while. Every couple of weeks we'd go over, and I'd go over and we'd watch movies in the basement. But we would talk about art projects and artsy stuff. Now, it turns out that for about 8 years up to that point, I had been working on a novel and tinkering with it, and I finally decided that I was going to self-publish the thing, which I did. Down in the notes, you will see a link to A Nice Place to Live. What was I trying to do? It's a horror novel with yucks. Seemed like a good idea at the time, but the reality is in bookstores, there's where they have the books for horror, and then there's where they have the books for funny and yucks, but there's like no in between. There's no funny horror. So okay, I miscalculated. That's why I didn't sell as many as I wanted to. But going back to when I'm finally making the decision to go ahead and do this, well, I need a cover, and I went to him, and we started talking about it. The process of putting this cover together was amazing. We had so much fun doing this. It's a lot of my ideas, and it was also, he gave me a range of choices. It's like, it's going to be your decision, but I'm going to give you like different positions of the skull, or, you know, things like that. If you take a look at the cover, in fact, wait a minute, I should just pop the cover up right here for you to get a gander at it. There is a very interesting effect. You're looking from the bottom of a farm pond up into the sky, and on the surface of the water are ripples. And that was done with an algorithm that he created and was proprietary. And very proud of it, very protective of it too. There was actually this controversy with me and him and the publishing company. They wanted his artwork with the layers, and he's like, I'm not giving them what they're asking for. They'll reverse engineer my shit and steal it. I'm like, okay. So gives you some idea of how conscientious he was about the work. So it was a great experience. We got the novel published. I got the novel published. We actually even had to go to a lawyer and set up distribution of rights because we were co-owners of the intellectual property. And so I'm starting to think, well, I met this guy. We work really, really well together. Maybe we can go into business together somehow. You know, merge our talents. Graphic novels, right? That's what I'm thinking as I'm trying to decide how I'm going to go out and actually physically market the book, like show up at a bookstore with a little table. It would be me, it would be him. I'd say, I wrote the book, but he created the art, okay? He made my ideas come alive. That's what I had in mind. And then the girl he was living with asks him to leave. And it was kind of the beginning of a slide. The next thing I know, he's dating this woman who snorts cocaine off the dashboard of her car while she's driving. So now I'm troubled by this development. Now when I would see him at a coffee shop, he'd been using so much cocaine. It's not funny. I mean, his skin was splotchy. It was like white and pink, and I'd seen that before. He let his nose hairs grow out. So he's always doing like this stuff. Like, you know, I can't take this guy on the road with me at this point. It's like, oh, and I got mad at him too. I mean, I thought he was throwing away an opportunity. He may not even know why I got pissed at him exactly, because I never spelled it out. I'm just, get the fuck away from me, take a hike. That's how I felt about it. However, it turns out that he had been homeschooled, right? And I started saying, you know, I haven't met anybody who was homeschooled that wasn't crazier than a shithouse rat. And technically that's true, because he's the only guy I knew who was homeschooled. So I assumed this bias, you know, this bias formed in my head, and it's fueled by anger too, right? So homeschool. I mean, actually, I guess what I was looking for was an explanation. How did this happen? You know, there's another opportunity slips through my fingers. How did this happen? Homeschooled. Anyway. There was something I did not know. This guy was on psychotropic medications. Right? Even back when we were doing the artwork, I had no idea. It just never came up. There was nothing came up that would even hint at that sort of thing. Nothing I saw. So then I find out later, no, this was actually the case. And he started having a problem when they couldn't come up with medications that were helping him. He was transitioning from one group of meds to another, not successfully. Now, I didn't know this. I'm like, oh, is that what was going on? So it wasn't homeschooling that made him crazier than a shithouse rat. He already was crazier than a shithouse rat. I didn't know. Okay. So magically, I no longer feel that way about homeschooled people, because there's probably a lot of great homeschooled people out there who have had, successful careers. So no sense, besmirching their reputation just because of this. And, it's one of those situations where you step back and you go, yeah, I don't feel that way anymore. And just to make sure that we're clear here, I don't bear this guy any ill will. I mean, after I was pissed at him for a while, I'd see him on the street, I'd be nice to him, but no question of, he and I ever doing anything together. It was that sort of thing. The last time I saw him, no, the time before last I saw him, and he's like, well, I'm going to get off meds, and I'm going to do it through yoga and meditation and, just getting my mind right and eating right and doing all this. And I says, well, I wish you luck. I think it was about 3 or 4 months later, I did see him on the street, and it was kind of like kabuki theater. And I'm like, oh, that's too bad. That's too bad. And so, as you can see, once I got to the end of everything I needed to know, having a bias against people who homeschool was just me being pissed off at this guy. So I've taken my bias apart, and what have I found? I found that I chose to have a bias. I found that I talked myself into having a bias, and it was easy. Never met anybody who was homeschooled that wasn't crazy and a shithouse rat. Look at them, in my mind. There was probably even a justification if I sat down and thought about it, in the sense that, and this is probably what I felt, the homeschooling was incomplete. There's gaps in his education. Once he got out in the real world, he started making poor decisions. But that wasn't the reality. The reality was his neurochemistry was doing loop-de-loops, and that's why he was making poor decisions. You go through all of this like I did, and the idea of a bias, my bias, it's like just naked. It's just there. Bias is what I would call another other for labels. That's all my bias was, just tossing around a bunch of labels, kind of thoughtlessly too. Now, the label, the generalization, and a word I really don't like, the typification, is what you find at the top of the ladder of abstraction that S.I. Hayakawa talks about in Language and Thought in Action. And we're going to pick up there in the next video. Moving forwards into the ideas of S.I. Hayakawa. I'd love to give you some background from other sources, giving a broader perspective to the SI filter I'm building for you. For example, did you know that your vocal cords are muscles? Really? I didn't know that. Although it makes sense. I've been doing videos since 2017, and I'd like to think that I'm becoming a better speaker over time, strengthening the vocal apparatus. I found this out in a book that I just happen to have in my library, and I came across it and I went, oh, vowels and consonants? It's written by Peter Ladyfoge in 2000. He was one of the country's top phoneticians when he was still alive. I'm halfway through the book. It's even got a CD in it with a lot of examples of what he's talking about. Since my business is now public speaking, I thought it might be a good idea to know what's in here. vowels in a word are the core. Consonants are generally the way to start or stop a word. Here's another fun fact that might surprise you. Speech is gestures of the vocal organs. How about that? You gesture with your hand, you gesture with your tongue, and your lips, and your lower jaw. Also, Dr. Lady Foge points out that speech and language are not exactly the same thing. And I can almost hear you say, really? And I'm like, I'm afraid so, because language is detachable. You wouldn't say an email in language are the same thing, or a text message in language are the same thing. The point being made here is that speech and emails and text messages and all that other stuff are carriers of language, carriers of information. Which is why you can study language as an abstract subject. You can even remove the meaning from language and study its structure alone, which is where linguistics comes in. I'll give you an example of what's known as transformational grammar. Do you remember the video I did called The Dazzling Septic Tank, where I had this skit with me and a therapist? I gotta tell you something about my friend, the walking, talking human encyclopedia. I went to a therapist one time, and I said, hey, Mr. Therapist, my friend, the walking, talking human encyclopedia, he's mean to me all the time. And the therapist is like, all the time? You mean 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? 365 days a year, he also adjusts for leap year? Is that what you mean, all the time? I'm like, well, when you put it that way, maybe all the time. And the therapist's like, aha, you're exaggerating. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe you're right. And I was like, yeah, of course I'm right. He's like, can you see how it's the source of all your problems? And I'm like, uh-huh. And it's like, wow, I feel so small all of a sudden. And the therapist is like, good. That was the gag. What I was doing was taking that abstraction, that label all the time, and putting it at the top of S.I. Hayakawa's ladder of abstraction, right? And what I had the therapist do was go down that ladder from the label, pointing out particulars that aren't being addressed. Neat, huh? Another interesting book that I came across is The Social Construction of Reality by Peter L. Berger and Thomas Luckman. This is from 1966. Now, the reason I picked this up was I thought, social construction of reality. Well, I'm on social media. Maybe this will help. Well, it turns out that it's sociology, and sociology is not my most favorite type of reading, because what they do is they describe the obvious with very big words. And then there's this glossary of big words, and they just keep using the big words over and over and over. However, there is merit in pointing out the obvious, especially when you point out lots of obvious things, and they ask you to take a step back and look at the big picture, and then you go, oh, that's what that looks like, huh? But what I found interesting in this book was they came up with something I would call the communication scale of anonymity. And I just found this absolutely fascinating. You got this scale, right? And on one end of the scale is the face-to-face communication. Yeah, it's the best. And you want to know why? Because when you're in front of me and I'm in front of you, we have the best access to what's known as our subjective experience. Because I can see your face. I can see if you're smiling or frowning, if your eyes are open, or if they're like half shut, or you're looking around, whatever. You get the idea. On the anonymity scale, the next place where they go is the phone conversation. This is 1966. But the point they're making is, okay, now I'm talking to you on the phone. I can't see your face now. So that part of your subjective experience is blocked off. So on this scale, we move further and further towards anonymity, and even though they don't say this, I do. On the furthest end of the scale, what you have is a sign for Coca-Cola on the side of the building. It says, drink Coke, right? It's a message, but you don't know who it came from. The people who put it up there are anonymous. So this is another example of language's detachability. So what I'm doing for you here is not necessarily to turn you into a better public speaker, although it wouldn't break my heart if that happened. No, what I'm trying to do is make you a more knowledgeable listener, a savvier consumer of information, because nowadays, in an information economy like we have, that's where the action's at. So, what did the German clockmakers say to the clock? We have ways of making you tick-tock. So, right now, you should have a pretty good foundation for understanding S.I. Hayakawa as we plunge ahead into language and thought and action. From here on out, I will reread a chapter of the book, and I will condense it for you. The first chapter is Language and Survival. Old S.I. cuts to the chase. Now, there are two things about S.I. Hayakawa I really like. The first was he was a United States Senator. I love that we're able to bring him into this, and he already has a political reputation behind everything else. And we can use his example as a standard which we could hold other senators. Now you got to understand, old SI is from the Reagan era, and that generation is mostly gone, dying out. But still, and this is the second thing I like about SI, he was probably one of the most famous English professors of all time. His book, Language and Thought and Action, has been taught in schools since 1938. You almost want to say, when's this going to get through to people, right? Because consider, journalism school. You mean to tell me this book doesn't get taught? People aren't exposed to it? I mean, if you look really close, I hope you can see that in the purple strip right there, but basically it's with an introduction by Robert McNeil of the McNeil-Lehrer Hour from PBS. He writes this glowing introduction to this book, and it's like, yes, if all journalists felt that way. I mean, I picture Chuck Todd as an undergrad. Did he read this book? Was it taught to him? Did he forget he read it like I did? Well, what I'm doing here today is finishing up with the preface to S.I. Hayakawa's Language and Thought and Action. I got one more thing I want to cover. I promise I'll get to chapter 1 later on today when I go up to the farm. But at the end of the preface, OSI mentions general semanticist Alfred Korzybski and his 1933 book on semantics called Science and Sanity. Korzybitsky is the one who coined the famous phrase, "The map is not the territory." There's the world out there, and then there's the map of it between your ears, and they're not necessarily the same thing, but I'm sure you can take it from there. Obviously, S.I. Hayakawa was heavily influenced by Korzybitsky. Actually, the book is 900 pages long. I have a PDF file of the thing. It's got 6 prefaces. I will be over 100 years of age by the time I get it finished. But obviously, S.I. had read it, maybe even more than once. And if you go down to your favorite bookstore looking for a copy of Language in Thought and Action, you will look under linguistics/psychology if you want to find it. And that's bullshit. This is a book on semantics. The study of meaning. Possibly the most important and the most dangerous subject in the entire world, because people kill each other over meaning. Which brings us to Joe. Joe was somebody I used to know. Now, I've met a lot of very, very interesting people post 9/11, right? Joe goes right to the top of the list. Joe Tamboola, that's Tamboola. Compare it to my last name if you're so inclined. I will do a separate video on Joe, probably sooner rather than later. But for our purposes, Joe was somebody I would see in the coffee shops. Joe would invite me to sit and we would talk. This actually went on for more than a year, like kind of weekly. Joe gave me the greatest lesson in semantics I could imagine. Not on purpose. Let me explain. Joe was not stupid, but Joe was an idiot in the classical sense of the word. If you go back to the Greek root words, you find idiotes, meaning layman or ignorant person, but you also find the word idios, meaning one's own, something self-contained. You get words, modern words like idiom and idiosyncratic out of it, which would be another way of saying Joe lived in Joe's world and nothing really got through. Here was one of Joe's interesting ideas. Joe says, competition's a bad thing. I'm like, if you say so. He's like, no, it is. Competition is taught, and we should stop teaching competition. Now, the first thing that pops into my head is in the animal kingdom, you see a hell of a lot of competition for territory, food, mates. I'm like, okay, Joe. I says, Joe, if competition is taught, who taught the first person competition? And Joe said, it's a paradox. Okay, so you see what I'm dealing with here, okay? And then there was the other time. Joe's there. Imagine playing chess without checkmate. Even at that moment, I realized what Joe was doing. Joe was taking a game like chess, very well known, and removing its core feature and just like pushing it off to the side and going, well, what do you think? I'm somebody who read Bobby Fischer's book on chess a long, long time ago. Chapter 1, page 1, How to Do Checkmate. Okay, I mean, if you remove checkmate from chess, it's no longer chess. I don't know what it is. Right? I'm thinking, moving around pieces of plastic on a tabletop? Well, that's kind of what it is. Sneaky way for two gay guys to kill time before one decides to jump the other? Maybe. So I'm like, Joe, it's no longer chess. You've taken a big chunk of meaning from chess. It's no longer chess. He's like, yes, it is, but it's more like dance. Dance? Yeah. And you could appreciate the beauty of the moves. We never got this far into it. I never got a clarification on whether you can still remove pieces from the chessboard. Well, basically then it's, a biker brawl in a bar parking lot, but other than that, and knowing how Joe thinks, he probably wouldn't even allow pieces to be removed from the board. So it's basically, yeah, Joe found a way to move it in, turn it into moving pieces of plastic around. Okay. So either one of two things is going on here. The tragedy of low T, so that it is essentially pickled Joe's brain in estrogen, or Joe was a woman passing herself off as a man. And I do have a couple of reasons for believing that may be true. Joe said it's a paradox. There was more to that conversation afterwards. And just for a quick review, Joe believed that competition was bad. Competition is taught. And that we shouldn't teach competition. We shouldn't teach competition. I could have did some transformational grammar upside Joe's head with that statement there. What do you mean by teach, Joe? And Joe would be like, oh, what do you mean by what do you mean? I don't know what you mean. And I'm like, well, Joe, you said teach. Do you mean in school? Are you saying competition is taught in school? And Joe would be like, I don't know. I'm like, all right, Joe. I'll even concede that you're in the ballpark, even though I don't ever remember being in high school or college and being offered courses on competition. But if you're thinking like middle school, high school, the playground, you will, yes, learn competition. But nobody's going to be teaching it to you. You're just going to be seeing it in action and learning about your world as you spend more time among kids. The first time you see the big kid shove the small kid, you go, wow, that really does work, doesn't it? Or if you see two evenly matched guys fighting over a girl, there's not going to be a quiz afterwards. It's not for your benefit. It's an emergent property. Competition is an emergent property. I shrugged, but that's kind of why I said, Joe, if competition is taught, then who taught the first person competition? And that's when Joe went, it's a paradox. I said, paradox? I'll give you a paradox, okay? It's called the Spanish barber paradox. It comes out of logic studies. It's rather famous, and it goes something like this. There is a small town in Spain with only one barber. The barber shaves every man who does not shave himself. Does the barber shave himself? And Joe's like, that's not a paradox. And I'm like, well, yes it is. And he's like, no it isn't. I'm like, yes it is. And he's like, no it isn't. I'm like, no point arguing. And I'll tell you what, let's be fair to Joe. Let's be fair to Joe. That particular paradox contains a semantic dirty trick. Okay, and I know it does, and I can understand him reacting negatively to it. The trick is, what you have is something in the sphere of human activity, and you're taking Aristotle's two-valued logic and applying it to it. You're making it this weird yes or no decision trying to answer this paradox. Yeah, that's what happens. I mean, the barber shaves every man who doesn't shave himself. Does he shave himself? And the answer is, because you could rephrase it, there is this small town in Spain with only one barber. The barber shaves every man who doesn't shave himself, with the exception of himself. Does the barber shave himself? And the answer is yes. So you've gotten around the problem that you have that creates the paradox. That's another reason why I like S.I. Hayakawa, because in Language and Thought and Action, he said that Aristotle's two-valued logic is only useful in mathematics. To take it and apply it to the sphere of human activity, like the Lester Holts and the Chuck Todds of the world do, that's folly. The Human Nature Channel presents Don't Eat the Deadly Chili, based on a true story. On Saturdays, the Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia cooks dinner for me at his residence. The cleanup man, his roommate with a room on the second floor, also cooks me dinner from time to time. The purpose of both dinners is to have a full stomach in preparation for a night of heavy drinking and movie viewing until the wee hours of the morning. The cleanup man is something of a gourmet. The Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia fancies himself something of a gourmet, so there is a level of competition going on here. I usually get to their house around 5:30 in the afternoon. After dinner, the Walking Talking Human Encyclopedia and I will leave, hop into my car and drive over to my place where there's a big screen TV, a shitload of DVDs, some which you can see in the background, and the aforementioned night of heavy drinking. Wastrels in the grand tradition are we. One particular Saturday around 3 in the afternoon, I was puttering around the apartment when my cell phone lit up. I picked it up and I saw I had a text message from the cleanup man. The text said, "Call me, urgent." Okay, I punched in his number and put the phone to my ear. After a few rings, he answered. I said, "What's up?" He said, "Dude, is he cooking you dinner today?" I said, "Yeah." "Well, you know how I am about food preparation, and I don't like the way he's been handling that pound of ground meat." "Oh," I said, "what's he doing wrong?" "Well, first he left that frozen ground meat out in the alley so the dogs could piss all over it, to thaw it out." "Oh," I said, "yeah, and the dogs wouldn't even eat it. That should tell you something." "It does," I said. Then he takes that pound of ground meat back inside and puts it on the kitchen counter under the hanging fly strip. He lets it sit there for 3 days, and dude, you know how that fly strip is. There are so many dead flies on it, you can't see the sticky surface anymore. And the flies, they're falling apart. Legs and wings and heads are sprinkling down on whatever's under them. "Oh my gosh," I said, becoming alarmed. Then he said, "Your friend takes that ground meat and puts it on a plate. He puts a whole bunch of diced onions on the plate and carries it into the bathroom. With the plate on his lap, he was mixing the onions into the meat while taking a shit." "Oh my gosh," I said. "And he didn't even wash his hands after. Dude, if I were you, I'd try and find some way to get out of eating whatever it is he wants to cook." "Okay," I said, "I get the picture. If his handling of the ground meat is as bad as you say, I'll need a backup plan." "I know. If he hasn't started cooking yet, I'll say, 'Hey, no sense in you slaving over a hot stove at this late date. We'll just go over to my place and I'll spring for a battleship from the Triangle. That should work.'" "Good," said the cleanup man. "I thought it only fair to warn you. And don't tell him I said any of this." "Okay, I won't. And I appreciate the heads up. Thank you." "You're welcome. What are friends for anyway, huh?" So 5:30 rolled around and I'm walking up the steps and onto the porch. The front door was unlocked, so I stepped in, and after closing the door, I went through the hall and into the kitchen. There was the walking, talking human encyclopedia, wearing a white chef's hat and apron, holding the end of a wooden spoon and stirring whatever was inside a tall steel pot with multiple streaks of something brown escaping down the sides. The streaks traveled all the way to the gas stove's flame, where they met with hissings and sputterings. As the walking, talking human encyclopedia stirred, a dark gray cloud rose from the pot and collected before the doors of the upper cabinets. "Hey," I said. He looked away from the pot and said, "Hola! We're having chili tonight." "Chili?" I said. "Yeah. Last Saturday we talked about having chili today and you said fine. Remember?" "Oh yeah, I remember." "Good, because you're in for a treat. This is a family recipe." "Oh good," I said. "I'll just go into the dining room and take off my coat." I turned and went through the doorway between the rooms. Just inside the dining room and on the wall was a rotary dimmer switch. One of those kinds where you have to press the button to turn on the chandelier full of CFL bulbs. You can turn the knob one way and make it go bright. Turn it the other way and make it go dark. Or make it just so you can see what the hell you're doing. The chandelier, which was bizarre enough, hung over a dining room table with 5 chairs, 2 on either side and 1 at the end, all squeezed together because the other half of the table was stacked halfway to the ceiling with books and newspapers, Arby's coupons, and DVDs. On the last bare space available, a lot of miniature figurines and dramatic poses from Dungeons and Dragons, trolls and giants and everything in between were all scattered about as if making a prison break from a security max, and this was the view from the sheriff's helicopter. After emptying the contents of my pockets on the table, I hung my coat on the furthest chair, then sat. I grabbed the ashtray, which was a little ceramic statuette of some character you'd see sitting cross-legged at a Rusted Root concert. He wore a green shirt with a medallion around his neck, and on his head was a fat knit hat in African yellows and greens with some dreadlocks sticking out from under. He had a patchy beard and sunglasses, and pinched between the thick ceramic lips was a roach so huge the bright end could be a postcard sunset. Above his head, Atlas style, he held an ashtray. "We're in this together," I said to Ashtray Man, and I reached for my pack of Dunhills. Suddenly, the cell phone went off in my pocket. I reached in and pulled it out and checked the message. The text said, "He made chili." I texted back, "I know." I slipped the cell phone back in my pocket, a mistake since it went off a second later. I pulled it out and opened and read the next message. "Did you eat the chili yet?" "No, not yet," I replied, and I put the cell phone on the table. The walking, talking human encyclopedia came into the dining room carrying spoons and napkins. "Who is texting you?" he said. "The man upstairs," I said. "Well, what does he want?" And without waiting for an answer, he returned to the kitchen. "Oh, he wants to know what we're doing tomorrow," I said. The cell phone went off again. Again, I flipped the lid and checked the message. "I wouldn't eat it if I were you." I texted back, "I'll take my chances." I put the phone back on the table. Through the doorway into the kitchen, I could see the walking, talking human encyclopedia with his back to me, once again at the stove, having resumed stirring that chili with a wooden spoon. He kept stirring for a few moments, then stopped and gawked. He removed a stick because the bowl of the spoon had fallen into the chili. "Oops," he said, and started to laugh. "This spoon comes in 2 pieces. I'll need another." He walked to his right and out of view. My cell phone went off again. Again, I picked it up and checked the message. "I warn you." The walking and talking human encyclopedia stuck his head through the doorway and said, "Tell him you're eating." I closed the phone. I think he said everything he's wanting to say. The walking and talking human encyclopedia ducked back into the kitchen. A few minutes later, minus chef's hat and apron, he returned carrying a steaming earthen bowl in each hand. He placed the bowl of chili before me. He placed his at the head of the table where he usually sits. He turned and left the dining room and seconds later returned, this time carrying 1 plate with a gray-white mountain of diced onions and another of a greenish-yellow mountain of diced jalapeno peppers. He put both plates before me, then plopped into his chair. He picked up his spoon and looked at me with a grin. "Dig in," he said. I picked up my spoon and I noticed my hand was shaking. I said, "How many of those onions can I have?" "You can have as much as you like," he said. "And the jalapenos?" "Same." With my left hand, I reached forward and grabbed the plate of onions. I brought it over, and with my spoon, I scraped it all into the chili. I put the plate back, then grabbed the plate of jalapenos and repeated the process. My theory was, if there was anything bad in the ground meat, the combination of onions and jalapenos should kill it. I took my spoon and dipped in and began to stir. As I did, I looked over at the walking, talking human encyclopedia. I noticed he ate chili with a rotary hand motion that had a disturbing resemblance to a spinning blade on a push mower. I went back to the chili I was stirring. Then I stopped. The moment of truth had arrived. I can't stir forever. With my spoon, I scooped up some of the chili, opened my mouth, and let it slide in. After thoroughly chewing the jalapenos and onions and beans and meat, I swallowed. "How is it?" asked the walking, talking human encyclopedia. "Good," I said. My pack of Dunhills was near my left hand. Dropping my spoon into the chili, which got sucked down like into quicksand, I slid out a cigarette. I popped it into my mouth and grabbed the lighter. I grabbed the white guy with dreadlocks ceramic ashtray and pulled him close. Switching my cigarette to my left hand, I grabbed my spoon. I had work to do. "Care for some music?" said the walking, talking human encyclopedia, and he got up and went into the kitchen to turn on the radio. I remember thinking, what are friends for anyway? Have a good one.
I want my money.